I want to be clear from the outset that I did not get what I ordered. The agency in St. Paul had been recommended to me by a man named Geddes, who ranched the valley south of mine, and had used them 2 years prior to procure a wife who was, by his account, sensible and undemanding. I took this as a recommendation of the agency's judgment. I wrote them a letter in January of 1882 that was, I believed, specific. I said I needed a woman who could cook for one man and occasional hands, manage a ranch household without supervision, and conduct herself with the minimum of drama that ranch life required. I said I was not looking for companionship in the parlor sense of the word. I said I was a working rancher with a working operation, and I required a working partner of the domestic variety, and that my requirements were practical rather than sentimental. I said specifically that I preferred a woman of quiet disposition. I do not know what letter the agency read when they matched me with Cora Finch of Dayton, Ohio. I have since wondered whether she specified anything in her application letter, and if so, what. I have asked her about this exactly once, and she said she had described herself as adaptable and capable, which she appeared to believe was the same thing as what I'd asked for. It is not the same thing. Cora Finch stepped off the Northern Pacific at Millward Depot on a Thursday in May with one large trunk, one carpetbag, a crate of books that required its own freight arrangement, and an immediate observation about the loading dock. I was standing at the edge of the platform with my hat in my hands because Geddes' wife had told me that holding your hat showed respect, and I had not yet decided whether to ignore this advice. I had a sign with her name on it, which I felt was excessive but which the agency had suggested. I was holding the sign. I was already regretting the sign. She came down the steps of the car with the particular posture of a woman who has been sitting on a train for 4 days and has decided that posture is the only thing she can control at this point, and she looked at the sign, and she looked at me, and she said, "The loading dock is pulling away from the building on the east end. Someone needs to address that before winter." I said, "How do you know which end is east?" She said, "I have been watching the sun for 4 days. It is currently west, which makes that end east." I looked at the loading dock. I had been meaning to address it since October. I said, "Harlan Voss." She said, "Cora Finch, the crate of books is fragile. Please tell the freight man." That was the introduction. I told the freight man. We loaded the trunk into the wagon and argued briefly about where the carpetbag should sit. She felt it should be accessible. I felt it should be stowed. And we arrived at a compromise that satisfied neither of us. And I drove the 12 miles back to the Voss Ranch in a silence that I had intended to be comfortable, and which was not, because Cora Finch was not a woman who experienced silence as neutral. She experienced it as something to fill. She filled it with observations. The grass was better than she'd expected. She'd read that the Montana ranges were being overgrazed, which I did not know she had read, and she was curious whether I ran a rotational system or used fixed pastures. The Bridger Range to the west was still showing snow, which she calculated meant a later than usual spring runoff. The fence line along the North Road needed attention, specifically 3 posts in the section nearest the road junction, which she could see from the wagon. I had been meaning to do those posts since March. I said, "Do you always talk this much?" She said, "Do you always ask questions you already know the answer to?" I drove the rest of the 12 miles without speaking. She looked at the country with the attentive interest of someone filing it all away, which I would later understand was exactly what she was doing. The ranch house was not what I'd have called a showplace. It was a working house, a 2-story log structure with a covered porch on the south side, and a root cellar that needed new steps, and a kitchen that was functional in the way that a thing is functional when a man who doesn't particularly care about kitchens uses it alone for 6 years. I had cleaned it, after a fashion. I had removed the items that seemed most objectionable and put them in the barn, which was Geddes' wife's advice, and which in retrospect I should have considered more carefully before taking. Cora walked through the house with a thoroughness that reminded me of the way a good stock buyer walks a pen of cattle, nothing missed, nothing commented on yet, but everything noted. She opened the root cellar and looked at the steps and said nothing. She looked at the kitchen stove and tried the damper and said nothing. She went upstairs and looked at the room I'd prepared for her and was quiet for a moment. She came back downstairs and said, "The stovepipe needs the creosote cleared. It's a fire risk." I said, "I know." She said, "The root cellar steps need replacing." I said, "I know." She said, "There are 6 items of ranch equipment stored in the room off the kitchen that would be better placed in the barn." I said, "Those were in the barn." She looked at me for a moment. I said, "I moved them for company." She said, "Move them back. I need that room for preserving." I said, "It's May." She said, "Preserving season starts in July. If I reorganize in July, I lose 3 weeks. If I reorganize now, I have 2 months to plan." She looked around the kitchen. "Also, your flour is in the wrong place. Flour goes nearest the stove. Where you have it, you're adding 12 steps per baking session. Over a year, that's," she calculated briefly, "considerable." I moved the flour. I want to be honest about why I moved the flour. It was not because I had concluded she was right, although she was. It was because something in the delivery, the considerable, with the pause before it where she'd actually done the arithmetic, landed differently than I expected. I had anticipated complaints. I had anticipated a woman dismayed by a working ranch that was not a parlor. What I had not anticipated was a woman who would calculate the inefficiency of my flour placement in her first 20 minutes on the property. I moved the flour and went out to do the evening feed and thought about what I had gotten myself into. The trial period the agency specified was 30 days. In 30 days, either party could dissolve the arrangement, me by returning her passage to Ohio, her by electing to go. After 30 days, if both parties were willing, we'd present ourselves to the circuit judge at Greel's Crossing and make it legal. I had privately anticipated using the 30 days. Not with cruelty. I was not a cruel man. But with the understanding that a woman from Ohio who had never run a cattle ranch might discover, inside 30 days, that she had miscalculated the undertaking, and that I could then send her home with her passage paid and my conscience clear. By the end of the first week, I understood this was not going to happen. Cora Finch did not miscalculate things. She had the stovepipe cleared by the second day, having recruited my one permanent hand, a taciturn Norwegian named Sven Holt, by the straightforward method of explaining the fire risk and asking if he was opposed to not burning to death. Sven was not opposed. By the third day, she had reorganized the kitchen on principles I did not understand, but which I noticed immediately resulted in meals appearing faster and with less apparent effort than any meal I had cooked in 6 years. By the fourth day, she had replaced the root cellar steps. She had found the lumber in the equipment shed, calculated what she needed, and simply done it, which was when I discovered she knew how to use a saw. I said, "Where did you learn to build steps?" She said, "My father built everything himself. I watched." I said, "You could have asked." She said, "You were mending fence. It needed doing. I did it." This was to become a pattern. What I had ordered, I reflected during that first week, was a domestic partner. What had arrived was a woman who treated the ranch as a problem to be solved, and who had, in her first 5 days, identified and addressed 6 things I had been meaning to address since the fall. She did not ask permission. She did not inform me in advance. She identified something that needed doing, determined whether she could do it, and did it. The 6th day, she reorganized the tack room. I came in from the south pasture to find the tack room arranged on a system I did not immediately recognize, with a chart on the wall indicating which items belonged where and a note in her precise handwriting explaining the organizational logic. I stood in the tack room for several minutes reading the chart. I did not say anything to her about the tack room. This was partly because the system, once I understood it, was better than my system, and I could not in good conscience object to an improvement, and partly because there was something about the chart with its careful handwriting and its evident thought that I did not want to discourage. I put things back in the places indicated by the chart. I did not tell her I had done this. She noticed anyway. She said at supper that evening, "You use the tack room." I said, "I use the tack room every day." She said, "You use the system." I said, "I use the room." She looked at me with the look she had, which I was beginning to recognize as the look of a woman who knows she has won an argument and is deciding whether to press the point, and then went back to her supper. Considerable, I thought, that was the word. The end of the second week brought the matter of the books. The crate had been sitting in the room off the kitchen while Cora determined where to put them. On the 14th day she appeared in the doorway of my study. I had a room I called a study, which contained my ledgers and a chair and a rifle rack and not much else, and asked whether I had objection to a shelf being installed on the east wall of the parlor. I said the parlor wall was fine. She said she would need someone to cut the lumber to length. I said Sven could do it. She said she had already spoken to Sven, who had agreed, and she was asking as a courtesy. I said that if she'd already arranged it, I wasn't sure what she was asking. She said she was notifying me, which was different from asking, and that she thought I would prefer to be notified. She was right that I preferred to be notified. I did not say so. The shelf went up on the 15th day. By the 16th, the books were arranged on it, and I discovered that Cora Finch owned, among other things, 2 volumes on soil chemistry, a comprehensive text on cattle disease and prevention that was more recent than anything I had, a history of Montana Territory that I had been meaning to read since it was published, the complete works of someone named Trollope whom she appeared to regard very highly, and a book called Practical Farmstead Management that she had underlined throughout in pencil with a thoroughness that suggested she had read it more than once. I looked at the cattle disease book for a longer time than I meant to. I said, when she came through the parlor, "This is more recent than anything I have on that subject." She said, "It came out in January. I ordered it in February." I said, "Can I borrow it?" She said, "You can read it here. I don't lend books." I sat in the parlor and read the cattle disease book for 2 hours. Cora sat at the other end of the parlor and read Trollope. We did not speak. It was the most comfortable evening I had spent in 6 years. I did not say this to her. I was not yet sure what to do with it. At the end of the 3rd week, Geddes came over. Geddes was a sociable man who liked to know how things were going, by which he meant he was curious about my situation with the mail-order arrangement, and had waited what he considered a respectful interval before coming to look. He arrived at mid-morning and sat at the kitchen table while Cora made coffee and I explained the spring pasture situation, and Geddes kept looking at Cora in the way of a man updating his assessment of a situation. Cora set coffee in front of both of us and sat down with her own cup. Geddes said to her, "Settling in all right, Mrs. Voss?" Cora said, "Miss Finch," and yes. Geddes looked at me. I looked at the table. Cora said, "We have 30 days, it's 22. Geddes said, "Right." He tried again. "What do you think of the country?" Cora said, "It's exceptional. The grass is better than I'd read. The water situation is manageable if the pasture rotation is maintained, and the Bridger Range gives better wind protection than the literature suggests. I'm concerned about the north fence line, and I've been looking at the soil chemistry in the east section. I think there's an opportunity there that's being under-leveraged." Geddes looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Harlan, where'd you find her?" I said, "Agency in St. Paul." He said, "Can you get me the address?" I said, "Your wife would object." He said, "I meant for the Haverson boy. He needs someone who can run a thing." Cora said, The Haverson boy should write his own letters. Geddes laughed. Cora went back to her coffee. I watched her not notice that she'd charmed him, which was part of how she charmed him. After Geddes left, I said, "You called yourself Miss Finch." She said, "That's my name." I said, "In Geddes's understanding, the arrangement." She said, "The arrangement has 8 days left. I'll use my own name until the arrangement concludes one way or the other." I said, "And which way do you think it'll conclude?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee cup. She said, "I think that depends on whether you'd be willing to do something about the north fence line before the summer grazing season. If you're not going to take the operation seriously, I don't see the point." I said, "I've been running this operation for 12 years. She said, "I know. Some of it you've run very well, some of it has room." She looked up. "I'm not criticizing. I'm saying that if we're going to talk about whether this continues, the fence line seems like useful information." I went out and looked at the north fence line that afternoon. She was right about the north fence line. I had known she would be. I started on the fence line the next morning. On the 28th day, 3 days before the trial period ended, we had the first real argument. It started over the east section soil, which she had been studying since the second week. She had done soil samples. I did not ask how she knew to do soil samples, and she did not explain. And she had a proposal for rotating a section of the east pasture into a hay crop that would reduce my winter feed costs by what she calculated to be a significant margin. I said the east section had been grazing land for 12 years, and I saw no reason to change it. She said the east section had been grazing land for 12 years because no one had tested the soil, and the soil results suggested it was better suited to hay, and that continuing to use it for grazing because it had always been used for grazing was not a reason, it was a habit. I said I had 12 years of experience with this land, and she had 28 days. She said 28 days of paying attention to the soil was more relevant than 12 years of not looking at it. I said this was my ranch. She said that was exactly what she was trying to help with. We were in the kitchen. The light was going outside and the stove was doing what it always did in the evenings, ticking as it cooled, and we were standing on opposite sides of the table with the soil sample notes between us. I said, "You've been here less than a month." She said, "I know how long I've been here." I said, "You've reorganized my tack room. You've rebuilt my root cellar steps. You've told my neighbor the water situation is manageable, and now you want to change the east section." She said, "I didn't tell him the water situation was manageable. I said it was manageable if the rotation was maintained, which is a different statement." I said, "Cora." She said, "Harlan." We looked at each other across the kitchen table. I said, "Why?" She said, "Why what?" I said, "Why do you care about the east section? You have 8 days left on the trial period. If you're leaving, the east section doesn't matter." She was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. She said, "I'm not leaving." I said, "You haven't said that before." She said, "You haven't asked before." I said, "I'm asking now." She looked at the soil sample notes, then at me. She said, "I came here because I needed to leave Ohio and the ranch sounded like honest work and I thought I could manage it. Those are still true." A pause. I didn't expect it to be interesting. I thought it would be work. It is work, but it's interesting work. The country is interesting. The operation is interesting. She stopped. I said, "And?" She said, "And I didn't expect you to be interesting either." I said, "I'm not interesting. I'm a cattle rancher who says 30 words a day." She said, "You moved the flour in the first 20 minutes without arguing about it. You read the cattle disease book for 2 hours and didn't tell me you found it useful until I saw you checking the notes I'd made in the margin. You fixed the north fence line because you knew I was right and you weren't willing to say so out loud." A pause. A man who does things instead of saying them is either dishonest or extremely honest. You're the second kind. I looked at the soil sample notes. I said the east section. She said yes. I said show me the numbers. She showed me the numbers. We sat at the kitchen table for the next 2 hours going through the soil results and the hay yield projections and the winter feed cost comparison. And by the end of it, I had not said she was right, but I had agreed to try the East Quarter on a one-season basis and evaluate. She knew that meant she was right. She didn't say so. This was new and I noted it. The 30th day came and went without ceremony. I had expected some kind of I didn't know what, a conversation, a decision made explicit. What happened was, I came in from the morning feed and breakfast was on the table and Cora was at the stove, and I sat down and ate, and after breakfast I said I was going to Greel's Crossing on Friday if she wanted to come, and she said she had a list of things she needed from the hardware store, and I said all right, and we went to Greel's Crossing on Friday. The circuit judge was there on Fridays. We went to the judge's office in the mid-afternoon, after the hardware store. Cora had her list. I had the paperwork the agency had sent. The judge was a practical man who had performed this service several times for ranchers in the valley, and who asked the necessary questions, and recorded the necessary answers, and congratulated us in a tone that suggested he had things to get back to. On the drive back to the ranch, Cora said, I should tell you something. I said, all right. She said, I wrote to the agency in February and my letter was not what you asked for. I described myself as adaptable and capable. I did not describe myself as quiet. I said, I know. She said, you knew. I said, I worked it out by about the 4th day. She said, and you didn't send me back. I said no. She was quiet for a moment. She said, why not? I thought about this carefully, the way I thought about things I wanted to say correctly. I said, because on the 3rd day you replaced the root cellar steps without being asked, and then came in and made supper without mentioning it. And I thought, a woman who fixes what needs fixing and doesn't make a speech about it is either going to be the best thing that ever happened to this ranch or the most challenging. Either way, it seemed worth 30 days to find out. She said, and? I said, both. She looked at the road ahead. I said, the east section will tell us by September. She said, the east section will tell us by August. I'm more optimistic than your yield projections. I said, you're always more optimistic than my projections. She said, your projections are conservative by habit. You'd rather be surprised than disappointed. I said, there's nothing wrong with conservative projections. She said, there's nothing wrong with accurate ones either. We drove the rest of the way home in the silence that had become ours, not peaceful exactly, not combative either, but the specific quality of two people who have said what needs saying and are now thinking about the next thing. It was, I had come to understand, not silence at all. It was a conversation conducted by other means. Summer arrived on the ranch the way it always did in Montana, not gradually but decisively, as though the country had been waiting and then made up its mind. The East Quarter went into hay in June, by which point I had stopped pretending I was doing it on a trial basis and had simply done it, because the numbers were what they were and Cora Finch's numbers were reliably accurate. She was in the east section most mornings of June, watching the hay come up with the attention of a person who has a financial interest in the outcome, which she now did, technically, as my wife, though I noticed she still introduced herself as Cora Finch in letters and to strangers, which I found I did not mind. She was Cora Finch. That was who she was. The Voss was a legal arrangement. The Finch was the person. Sven Holt had, by June, developed a rapport with her that I had not anticipated and could not quite explain. They communicated in a mixture of her precise English and his minimal responses and apparently understood each other completely. When I asked Sven what he thought of the arrangement, he said, She knows what she's doing. This was, from Sven, an endorsement of the highest order. We had 2 additional hands through the summer, brothers named Callum and Pete Marsh, who came up from the south for the grazing season and went back in the fall. They arrived in early June and spent the first week carefully not asking questions about the situation at the ranch house, which I appreciated. By the second week, they had determined that Cora was the person to talk to about the work schedule, which she had apparently made clear by the straightforward method of being the person who knew the schedule. I heard Callum tell Pete, when they thought I was out of earshot, that Mrs. Voss ran a tighter operation than most outfits he'd worked. He said Mrs. Voss. I noted that. In July, Cora got sick. It wasn't serious, a summer cold that went to her chest and kept her in bed for 4 days, but it was the first time since she'd arrived that the ranch ran without her, and I discovered in those 4 days several things I had known theoretically and not yet felt the full weight of. The kitchen ran adequately under my management. The schedule maintained itself. Sven and the Marsh brothers worked without direction. Everything functioned. It was also significantly less interesting. I brought her meals on a tray and left them outside her door, which was the arrangement she'd requested and which I honored. On the second day, she called through the door and asked if I had checked the hay in the east section, which was due to be turned. I said I had checked it. She said, what did it look like? I described it in terms of color and height, and she said it sounded about right, but to check again tomorrow morning and tell her. On the 4th day, she came downstairs. I was at the kitchen table with the ledger. She came in looking like a woman who had been in bed for 4 days and had decided that was enough of that, and she sat down across from me and said, the east section. I said, it's fine, I've been checking. She said, I know. Sven told me. I said, you've been talking to Sven. She said, he brings the water. We've established a reporting system. I said, you established a reporting system from your sickbed. She said, it seemed practical. I looked at her. She looked back with a directness that was simply her default mode, not aggressive, not soft, just present, looking at you and expecting to be looked back at. I said, you should have stayed in bed another day. She said, the hay won't wait another day. I said, I can manage the hay. She said, I know you can manage the hay. I wanted to see it. We went out to the east section together that afternoon. The hay was coming in better than my projections and close to hers. She walked the section with her hand trailing through the top of the crop at hip height, reading it by touch, and I walked beside her and watched her do it and thought, this is the most capable person I have ever shared a property with, and I had known it since the 3rd day and had spent 4 months refusing to say so out loud. I said, you were right about the east section. She stopped walking. She said, I know. I said, I'm telling you. She turned and looked at me. In the afternoon light, with the hay around us and the Bridger Range still showing a little snow on the highest peaks, she had the look of a person who is hearing something they've been waiting for and is deciding how to receive it. She said, you could have told me in June. I said, I'm telling you now. She said, why now? I said, because you were sick for 4 days and the ranch ran fine, but it wasn't, it was quieter. She said, you said you wanted quiet. I said, I thought I did. She looked at me for a long moment. The hay moved in the light afternoon wind. She said, what did you actually want? I thought about this honestly, the way I tried to think about things I wanted to say correctly. I said, I wanted someone who knew what they were doing and did it without needing me to manage it. I wrote to the agency and asked for quiet because I confused the 2 things. She said, you confused capable with biddable. I said, yes. She said, they're not the same thing. I said, I know that now. She looked at the hay. She said, I wrote and said I was adaptable and capable because I didn't know what I was going to. I thought I was describing what was useful. I didn't think about what you were expecting. I said, it worked out. She said, it did. A pause. I didn't expect it to. I thought I'd be here 30 days and go home. I said, you were never going to go home. She said, you don't know that. I said, you replaced the root cellar steps on the third day. A woman who replaces the root cellar steps on the third day isn't leaving at 30. Something shifted very slightly at the corner of her mouth. Not quite the smile yet, the preceding moment. She said, that's very sound reasoning for a man who only uses 30 words a day. I said I saved them up. She laughed. It came out full and real, the kind of laugh that has no performance in it, and I thought, there it is. That's the thing. That specific laugh in the east section with the hay coming in and the Bridger range behind her, that was the thing I had been building toward since I drove 12 miles from Millward Depot in a silence that wasn't peaceful. I hadn't known that was what I was building toward, but I knew it now. August arrived and the hay came in at a yield that was, as she had predicted, better than my projections and close to hers. We cut and baled over 8 days that required every hand on the property plus Geddes' 2 boys who came over for 3 days in exchange for my help with his roundup in September. Cora ran the water and the meals for 7 hands across 8 days with the particular organized calm of a person who has planned for every contingency and is not surprised by the one she hasn't planned for. She had a system for who ate when and what, and she executed it with the efficiency that had stopped surprising me and now just registered as, that's Cora, that's how she does things. On the 7th day, Geddes stopped by to collect his boys for the evening, and he stood in the yard and looked at the baled hay stacked against the equipment shed and said, Harlan, that's better than you've ever put up. I said, the east section. He said, always was good ground, that section. I said, that was pointed out to me. He looked toward the house, where Cora was visible through the kitchen window. He said, that woman of yours. I said, yes. He said, Geddes' wife wants to know if she'll come to the harvest social in October. I said, you'd have to ask her. He went to the kitchen window and had a conversation I couldn't hear, and came back with the look of a man who has been efficiently organized by someone who wasn't asking for his input. He said, she's bringing the soil chemistry notes. She's going to talk to me Haverson about the east section of the Haverson place. I said, of course she is. He said, Harlan. I said, yes. He said, where'd you find her? I said, agency in St. Paul. He said, I know you said that. I'm saying, where did they find her? I said, Ohio. He said, you asked for quiet. I said, I thought I did. He looked at the kitchen window again. He said, best thing that ever happened to your operation. I said, yes. He collected his boys and drove south. I stood in the yard for a minute after he left, looking at the baled hay and the equipment shed and the kitchen window. Best thing that ever happened to your operation. I went inside. September on the Voss Ranch was the specific busy of a ranch getting ready for winter, and Cora took to it with the energy she took to everything, purposeful, organized, comprehensive. The root cellar that had been reorganized in May now had the summer's preserving in it, shelved and labeled in her precise handwriting. The hay yield was logged in the ledger alongside my cattle counts and projected feed requirements, and her calculations for the winter ration, which were more sophisticated than anything I'd done before. She had also, in September, begun corresponding with a soil chemist at the Agricultural College in Bozeman, which I discovered when she showed me his reply letter with the air of someone sharing good news. I said, you wrote to an agricultural college. She said, I sent him the East section results. He's very interested. He thinks the methodology could apply to 3 or 4 other sections on comparable properties in the valley. I said, you're corresponding with an agricultural scientist about my land. She said, our land, a pause, if you have an objection. I said, I don't have an objection. She said, you have a face. I said, I always have a face. She said, this is the face you make when you've decided something is right but you haven't caught up to it yet. I said, I didn't know I had that face. She said, you've had it 7 or 8 times this summer. I've been tracking it. I said, you've been tracking my face. She said, I track useful information. She folded the letter. You could write to him as well. He'd like to hear from the owner of record. I wrote to him. He was indeed very interested. We corresponded through the fall about the east section and the soil results and the hay yield, and in November he wrote to say he was incorporating the data into a paper he was preparing for a regional agricultural journal. Cora received this news with the satisfaction of someone whose arithmetic has been confirmed by an independent party. She said, I told you the east section was under-leveraged. I said, you told me in May. She said, I know when I told you. I said, I know you know. She looked at me with the look that had started out as the measuring look and had become, over the summer and fall, something else, something warmer at the edges, less assessment and more recognition. The look of a person who knows what she's looking at and finds it worth looking at. She said, Harlan. I said, yes. She said, you had 30 words a day in May. You've been using more since July. I said, the operation has more to discuss. She said, the operation. Yes. I said, Cora. She said, yes. I said, you said in May you didn't expect it to be interesting. She said, I did say that. I said, is it still interesting? She was quiet for a moment in the way she was sometimes quiet, not the absence of thought but the presence of a great deal of it. She said, yes, a pause, more than I expected, which I didn't think was possible in May because in May I already expected more than I'd planned for. I said, that's a complicated sentence. She said, you parsed it. I said, I parsed it. She looked at the East Section notes on the table between us, at the letter from the Agricultural College, at the ledger with its careful columns, mine in my angular handwriting and hers in her precise script, side by side. She said, I didn't come here for this. I said, I know. She said, I came here because it was honest work and I needed to leave Ohio. I said, I know. She said, but she stopped, started again. The ranch is good, it's very good. I think it can be better and I think I know how to help make it better and that's what I came for. She looked up. She said, and the other thing is also true, which I wasn't expecting, but it is. I said, yes. She said, is it true for you? I said, Cora, I fixed the north fence line because you were right about it. I planted the east section because you were right about it. I wrote to the Agricultural College because you told me to. I paused. I do things when I've decided they're right. I decided a long time ago. She was quiet. Then she said, you could have said something. I said, I just did. The stove ticked in the cooling evening. Outside the window the September dark was coming down over the valley, and the hay was in the barn, and the root cellar was full, and the ledger had both our handwriting in it. She said, the winter is going to be long. I said, Montana winters usually are. She said, I'll need more books. I said, I'll write to the bookseller in Helena. She said, I already have. I'm expecting a crate in November. I said, of course you are. She laughed again, that full, real laugh that had no performance in it, and I thought for the second time, there it is. That's the thing. The same thing it had been in the east section in July, and the kitchen in May, and the tack room on the 6th day, when she'd watched me replace things in the correct order without saying anything. The same thing, just more so now, more real and more settled and more certain. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers, which was resting beside the Agricultural College letter, and she looked at our hands and then at me, and the look was the look of a woman who knows what she's looking at and has decided it is what she wants. She said, "I'll need lumber for a second shelf in the spring. The crate is going to exceed the existing capacity." I said, "I'll order the lumber." She said, "I'll calculate the dimensions." I said, "I know." The winter was long. Montana winters are long. We sat across from each other in the evenings with books and the ledger and the correspondence with the agricultural college and the careful plans for the spring. And the stove ticked, and the snow came down outside the window, and it was not what I had ordered. Nothing about it was what I had ordered. It was considerably better. The east section went in again in the spring, expanded. She had been right about 2 adjacent parcels as well, which she had identified in October, and which I had agreed to by November and planted by May. The hay yield that second year was what the agricultural college man called notable, and what Cora called what she had said it would be. By the second spring, Sven had started bringing questions to her as readily as to me. By the third spring, the Haverson boy had come to ask about the soil methodology, and left 3 hours later with a plan and a reading list, and the particular dazed look of a young man who has been organized by Cora Finch. She wrote to the agency in St. Paul in our second year, which I discovered when they wrote back, and I saw the return address on the envelope. I said, "You wrote to the agency." She said, "I wrote to thank them, and to make a suggestion about how they describe candidates." I said, "What suggestion?" She said that adaptable and capable and quiet are different things, and the agency should be clearer about which one they're promising. I said, "Did they respond?" She said, "They said they'd take it under advisement." I said, "Which means?" She said, "Which means probably nothing," but I said what was accurate. She always said what was accurate. This had stopped being a surprise and had become, like the full laugh in the soil sample notes, and the way she moved the flour on her first day, simply part of what she was. I had asked for quiet. I had received the best argument of my life, which had turned out to be the thing I needed without knowing I needed it. A person who said what was accurate, and did what was necessary, and replaced root cellar steps on the third day, and tracked my face across a whole Montana summer, and calculated the inefficiency of flower placement in her first 20 minutes on the property. She was not quiet. She was Cora Finch, and she was exactly right. In the evening sometimes she would be at one end of the parlor shelf with Trollope, and I would be at the other end with the Agricultural Journal, and the stove would be working, and the ranch would be settled around us in the dark, and I would think, I ordered something else entirely. I was entirely wrong about what I needed. And I thought, thank the good Lord for that. That is enough for any man. That is considerably more than enough.